historical aspects regarding the Hijrah today. So I'm really excited to see uh, it's all going to be discussing or really getting into. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions, and whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone with no partnership, that never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everybody, brothers and sisters, friends and family, everybody tuning into the live stream, and everybody joining us from the Zoom meeting. Jazakallah khairan for joining us again for our Sunday discussion, where we will be continuing the book When the Moon Split, which is a biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu compiled by Safiur, Rahman, Mubarakpuri. Today we're going to be jumping into where's this at? The Muslims migrate to Medina, page 127, inshallah, which will start getting into the history regarding the Hijrah, the first year of the Islamic calendar. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. Bismillah. So the Muslims migrate to Medina. So the second pledge of Aqaba had changed the equation considerably for the Muslims. They now had a new refuge in Yathrib, later turns into Medina, and its people were ready to protect them. And soon the Prophet ﷺ himself received revelation about migration to Yathrib. He told his companions, I have been informed that we will one day migrate from Mecca to the land of dates. I think that it is either Yamama or Hijr. On one occasion he said, I have been shown the place to which you will migrate. It lies between two hills of lava. It is either Hijr or Yathrib. And taking advantage of this new haven that had been offered to them, several Muslims migrated to Yathrib following the pledge. And the first immigrant was Abu Salama Makhzumi, the husband of Salama, and he attempted to migrate with his wife and children a year before the second pledge of Aqaba, but his clan would not allow him to take his family, so he was forced to migrate by himself to Yathrib. And a year later, Salama was allowed to join her husband. And Amir bin Rabia, his wife Layla bint Abi Hatma, and Abdullah bin Makhdum migrated after Abu Salama, and getting away proved difficult, though, because they had to slip out of Mecca past the watchful Quraysh. And Omar bin Khattab, however, left Mecca in full view of the Quraysh, and no one dared to try to stop him. He also took 20 others with him. And soon nearly all the Muslims in Mecca had migrated to Yathrib. Even the refugees in Abyssinia made their way there after hearing about the pledge of Aqaba. However, Abu Bakr, Ali, Suhaib, and Zayd bin Haritha stayed in Mecca together with those Muslims who were unable to migrate. And the Prophet ﷺ stayed on in Mecca as well, awaiting Allah's permission to leave. And he asked Abu Bakr to wait with him. And Abu Bakr had two very fast camels, and he would feed them acacia leaves to make them even stronger and swifter. And this way, he and the Prophet ﷺ could make a speedy escape once Allah's command to leave Mecca had come. So the Council of Dar al-Nadwa, so the Quraysh were enraged that the Muslims had found a place in the Arabian Peninsula itself where they could be able to thrive. And they also feared that the Muslims would become strong enough to control the northern trade routes and disrupt the pagans' trade. And since the Meccans depended on the goods carried by the caravans to and from northern Arabia and Syria, their fear was not unfounded. And there was also the growing worry that the Prophet ﷺ himself might escape any day to Yathrib, where his followers awaited him. He could set up a new power base, and eventually, which had to be avoided, an eventuality which had to be avoided. And to discuss their concerns, a special council was held at Dar al-Nadwa, where most of the prominent chieftains of the Quraysh were present. Iblis, Shaitan, was also present disguised as Sheikh Jalil of Najd. And Abul Aswad opened the meeting by saying, "Let us drive Muhammad out of our territory and be rid of him. That will set the matter right." And Sheikh Jalil didn't like this idea, stating, "Do you not see how sweet his words are and how he wins the hearts of people? If we exile him, he will simply find another tribe and make them his followers. With their help, he will attack your city and deal with you as he pleases. Think of another plan. Let us imprison him until he dies. He will experience the same kind of death poets of old did," Abu Bukhtari suggested. And Sheikh Jalil interjected again, "By God, if you make him a captive, the news will surely reach his companions who love him more than their fathers and sons. They might raid your territory and free him, and once their numbers increase, they will return and conquer you. Think of another plan." Finally, Abu Jahl, himself a rival of Shaitan, put forth his idea. "I have my own opinion," he began. "I see that none of you has touched on it so far. We should select a strong and smart youth of noble birth from each tribe. Each youth will be given a sword, sharp and deadly. These young men will move towards the Prophet as one man and strike him as one man. And since all of the clans will share his blood, Banu Abdul Munaf, Muhammad's protectors, cannot take on all of the Quraysh at one time. They will then have to accept blood money that we can pay off easily." "This is the best plan of all," Sheikh Jalil declared approvingly, and the council disbanded, relieved at having a solution at hand. Now it was time to make the necessary preparations. So Jibril alayhi salam brings the Prophet ﷺ the happy news. So meanwhile, Jibril came to the Prophet ﷺ with the tidings that Allah had ordered the Prophet to migrate. And Jibril told him the exact time he should depart and informed the Prophet of the plot to assassinate him. "Don't sleep in the bed you usually sleep in," he advised the Prophet ﷺ. And at noon, when everyone was napping, the Prophet ﷺ went to the house of Abu Bakr Siddiq and told him the happy news, and quickly they began to prepare both camels for the long journey. They also hired Abdullah bin Urayqat lady to lead them to Yathrib, and Abdullah knew this area between Mecca and Yathrib well, and although he was not Muslim, he agreed to escort the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr secretly. And the Prophet told Abdullah to meet them near Mount Thawar in 3 nights, and meanwhile the Prophet ﷺ began to engage himself in day-to-day activities so that no one would suspect that he was about to leave Mecca. So the Prophet ﷺ used to go to sleep after the evening prayer, and upon waking up around midnight, he would go to the Kaaba to perform the Hajjud prayers. And the night the Prophet ﷺ was to leave, he asked Ali to sleep in his bed after assuring him that no harm would come to him. And when everyone had gone to bed, the assassins surrounded the Prophet ﷺ's house, and they saw Ali wrapped in the Prophet's green mantle, lying in the Prophet's bed, and thought that he was Muhammad ﷺ. And the plan was for them to lie in wait for the Prophet and fall upon him when he came out of his house. And the Quraysh were unaware that just as they were plotting, Allah too was plotting, as mentioned in Surah 8, Ayat 30. "Remember how the unbelievers plotted against you to imprison you, to kill you, or to exile you from Mecca. They plot and plan, but Allah plans too, and the best of planners is Allah." So the Prophet ﷺ then leaves his home. So although Ali was in the Prophet ﷺ's bed, the Prophet ﷺ himself was still in the house surrounded by the assassins. And the Prophet ﷺ came out of the house and took a handful of dust, which he sprinkled above the young boys' heads while reciting the following verse. Surah 36, Ayat 9, "I placed a barrier in front of them and a barrier behind them. I've covered them so they cannot see." And the youths outside did not see the Prophet ﷺ leave. He went swiftly to Abu Bakr, and together they traveled not toward Yathrib, but in the opposite direction toward Yemen. Before dawn, they had covered a distance of about 5 miles, and then they took refuge in a cave of Mount Thawar. And unaware of the Prophet ﷺ's escape, the would-be assassins continued to wait for him to come out of the house. Only at dawn, when Ali awoke and came out, did they realize that they had been tricked, and they interrogated Ali about the Prophet ﷺ's whereabouts, but he pleaded ignorance. Then they dragged him to the Kaaba and kept him captive there, but he divulged nothing. Then they rushed to Abu Bakr's house and found that he had also disappeared. However, they did find his daughter Asma, who refused to tell them anything. Her calm defiance enraged them, and a furious Abu Jahl slapped her so hard that her earring flew out from her ear. And the Quraysh began searching for the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr and announced that there was a reward of 100 camels for each fugitive brought back dead or alive. So then they spent 3 nights in the cave. So when the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr arrived at the cave of Mount Dhar, Abu Bakr entered first to clear away anything that might injure the Prophet ﷺ. He found a few holes and stuffed them with pieces of cloth, and the Prophet ﷺ then entered and went to sleep with his head on Abu Bakr's lap, and suddenly something stung Abu Bakr's foot, but he did not even twitch, fearing he would wake the Prophet. And the pain was so intense that tears began to run down his cheek and onto the Prophet's face. And the Prophet ﷺ woke up and saw that Abu Bakr was in pain, and he applied his spittle on the injury, and the pain disappeared. And for 3 consecutive nights, the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr remained hidden in the cave. And during this period, Abu Bakr's son, Abdullah, would pass his nights nearby. And the clever young man would return to Mecca so early in the morning that the Quraysh had no idea that he had slept elsewhere. And each day in Mecca, he collected information about the activities of the Quraysh, and each night he updated the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr's slave, Amir bin Fuhaira, would graze Abu Bakr's goats near the cave so that both men could drink fresh milk. And early the next morning, Amir would drive the goats back to Mecca along the same route that Abu Bakr's son took to obscure his footprints. And meanwhile, the search party scoured the area south of Mecca where the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr were hiding. And once the Quraysh even came upon the mouth of the cave and they had looked down while standing on the edge of the cave, they would have surely found the men that they were hunting. And with the Quraysh so close to discovering the hiding place, Abu Bakr became very tense about the Prophet's safety. And the Prophet ﷺ reassured him, how can you be apprehensive about two with whom is a third, especially when the third one is Allah? So on the way to Medina, on the first night of Rabi al-Awwal, Abdullah bin Urikat Laythi, the guide hired by the Prophet ﷺ to take them to Yathrib, arrived in the valley of Mount Thar with Abu Bakr's 2 camels. So Abu Bakr's slave, Amir bin Fuhaira, accompanied them, and the guide first headed towards south, towards Yemen, and led the small group westward towards the Red Sea. And before reaching the sea, he veered north towards Yathrib, taking a seldom traveled route. And they journeyed all night and a half of the next day, and they stopped, and the Prophet ﷺ rested in the shade beneath a rock. And meanwhile, Abu Bakr found a herdsman who let him milk one of his goats. And when the Prophet ﷺ awoke, Abu Bakr gave him fresh milk, and they pushed ahead. And perhaps it was the next day when the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr passed by the tent of Mabad on the outskirts of Hadid near Mash'al, about 130 kilometers from Mecca. They asked her whether she had anything for 4 weary travelers, and she apologized, saying that her goats were grazing far away, and the only one at hand was a small goat that was unable to stay with the herd and didn't have a drop of milk to give. And the Prophet ﷺ asked for permission to milk it, and when he did, milk flowed from its udders. He filled a large bowl with milk and let her drink it. And after that, each of the travelers drank their fill. And when they had all finished, he milked the goat again and left the full bowl of milk for the woman. So after they resumed their journey, the woman's husband returned. Mabad told him about what happened, and she gave him such a complete description of the travelers that her husband exclaimed, "This was the man from the Quraysh that I've been hearing about. If I ever have the opportunity, I will join his followers." And on the third morning after the Prophet ﷺ's departure, the Meccans heard a voice echo from the streets. They were unable to find where it was coming from because it was not a voice of a human. It was a jinni, a spirit, saying, "Allah, Lord of the people, bless those 2 companions who reached the tent of Mabad in safety. They broke their journey, and in safety they resumed it. Anyone who befriends Muhammad finds success, O Quraysh. By driving Muhammad away, you have forfeited glory and dominion. Blessed is the tribe Banu Ka'ab. Their lady's tent became a refuge for Muhammad. Ask your lady about the weak goat and the milking bowl. The goat will inform you if you ask it." And when the Prophet ﷺ and his companions left Khalid, a man by the name of Suraka bin Malik bin Ushum Madalaji spotted them, and he thought he would capture the fugitives and take them back to Mecca to collect the reward. And as he charged ahead on his horse, it suddenly stumbled and he fell to the ground. And being superstitious, he drew an arrow to see how favorable the situation was. And the arrow he drew was unfavorable, but greedy for the bounty, he ignored the omen and mounted the horse again. And this time his horse carried him close enough to the fugitives that he could hear the Prophet ﷺ reciting the Quran. And Abu Bakr nervously looked back, but the Prophet ﷺ was unconcerned. And this time the forelegs of the horse sank into the sand, and again the rider tumbled to the ground. And Suraka cursed the horse, and with great difficulty he managed to pull the horse's legs out of the sand, but he looked behind, and he saw dust rising from the horse's hoof prints like smoke. And he quickly pulled out another arrow to find yet another bad omen. And now he was convinced that he would not be able to capture the Prophet ﷺ. He then called to the Prophet ﷺ and surrendered, and the travelers stopped and waited for him to come forward, and Suraka offered them food, but they refused his rations. And the Prophet ﷺ did, however, ask him not to tell the Quraysh of their whereabouts. And Suraka agreed and asked to be given a letter of safe conduct for future security. And the Prophet ﷺ asked Amr to write the letter on a piece of tanned leather. And Suraka then returned towards Mecca. He told all of the bounty hunters he met to go back because he had already searched the area and the fugitives were nowhere to be found. And the four travelers resumed their journey, and on the way, the Prophet ﷺ soon met Burida bin Husayb Aslami, along with 70 or 80 families of his followers, and they all embraced Islam and prayed the evening prayer with the Prophet. And Burida migrated to Medina after the Battle of Uhud. And the Prophet ﷺ also met Abu Tamim Aus bin Hajar Aslami at Arj, and at the time, the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr were riding the same camel because one of their camels had become weak. And Abu Tamim offered them a camel and sent along a slave named Mas'ud bin Hanida, who accompanied them all the way to Yathrib. And although Abu Tamim became Muslim, he chose to remain in Arj, and he would later prove useful to the Muslims in the Battle of Uhud by sending word through Masud, the slave, about the Meccans' advance towards Medina. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ reached the valley of Reem, he met Zubair bin Awam, who was accompanying a trade caravan of Muslims returning from Syria. He presented the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr with sheets of white cloth. So at the arrival of Quba, 14 years after becoming a prophet, on a Monday, the Prophet ﷺ arrived in Quba on the outskirts of Yathrib. The people of Yathrib, which was later named Al-Medina al-Munawwara, the city of light, had long awaited the Prophet ﷺ, and each day they would go to Hira and wait for him until the sun became unbearable. And one day the Prophet ﷺ, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what I'm reading here. One day the people returned to their homes after waiting a long time for the Prophet ﷺ. A Jew happened to catch a glimpse of a small group of white-robed travelers in the distance, and he called out, "O people of Arabia, what you have been waiting for has arrived." And the Muslims lifted their weapons and rushed to greet the Prophet ﷺ, and there was a great tumult as everyone ran to the edge of the desert to catch a glimpse of the travelers. And the Prophet ﷺ then turned towards the right and came to Banu Amr bin Auf at Quba. And after reaching Quba, the Prophet ﷺ dismounted and sat in silence. Now those of the Ansar, literally the supporters, the name given to those in Medina who became Muslim, had not seen the Prophet ﷺ and thought that Abu Bakr was the Prophet because his hair had grown a little gray. But when they saw Abu Bakr shade the Prophet with his sheet, they realized their mistake. And the Prophet ﷺ stayed at Quba in the house of Kulthum bin Hadam. And other sources, however, say that he stayed in the house of Saad bin Qathima. He stayed there for 4 days, during which time he laid the foundation of the Quba Mosque. And that Friday, he left Quba with Abu Bakr. He sent a message to Banu Najjar, the house of his maternal grandfather. His kinsmen came to Quba with their swords hanging from their sides and joined the Prophet ﷺ on his way to Medina. And when he arrived at the settlement of Banu Salim bin Auf, It was time to perform the Friday congressional prayer, and the Prophet ﷺ led 100 Muslims in prayer. Let's do a few more pages here, inshallah. So the Prophet ﷺ enters Medina. After performing the Friday prayer, the Prophet ﷺ and his entourage left for Medina. Jubilant crowds of men, women, and children greeted him, and the narrow lanes of Medina resounded with their happy voices. Women and children sang their welcome in a song that even now is sung by Muslims in memory of that happy day. Like the full moon, the Prophet ﷺ appeared among his people, stating, "The full moon has appeared before us. We must give thanks when called to Allah. You who have been sent to us bring commands that will be obeyed." And as the Prophet ﷺ rode through the streets of Medina, people would take hold of his camel's halter and invite the Prophet ﷺ to stay with them. "Let the she-camel go her way," the Prophet ﷺ would say. "She is guided by Allah." And finally, the she-camel knelt, but the Prophet ﷺ did not dismount. And the animal rose to its feet again, ambled ahead for some distance, and then turned back and knelt in the same place it had before. And the Prophet's mosque, Masjid al-Nabawi, was erected on this very spot. So many people vied with each other to give shelter to the Prophet ﷺ, but it was Abu Ayyub Ansari who hurried to lift the saddle from the she-camel and took it to his home. And the Prophet ﷺ remarked humorously, "A man must follow his saddle," and went along with Abu Ayyub, and Asad bin Zurara took hold of the halter, so he was allowed to take care of the animal. And the Ansar chiefs tried to outdo each other in welcoming the Prophet ﷺ, and each night the Prophet ﷺ would receive at least 3 or 4 trays of food. Everyone wanted the Prophet ﷺ to know that he had found a new home for his followers. So next, Ali migrates, and back in Mecca, Ali stayed on for 3 days after the Prophet ﷺ had left, and during this period, he settled all of the Prophet ﷺ's affairs in Mecca. He then left on foot and met the Prophet ﷺ in Quba, where he stayed in the house of Kulthum bin Hadam. And the Prophet ﷺ's family then migrates 6 months after the Prophet ﷺ had settled in Medina. He sent Zayd bin Haritha and Abu Rafi to Mecca, and they came back with the Prophet ﷺ's family, Fatima, Kulthum, Sauda, Ayman, and Osama bin Zayd, and Abdullah bin Abu Bakr also accompanied them along with the rest of Abu Bakr's family, Ruman, Aisha, and Asma. And Suhaib migrates. The Prophet ﷺ's departure triggered off a new wave of migration to Medina. The wealthy Suhaib, also known as Abu Yahya, i.e. the father of Yahya, had long been planning to migrate, only to be held back by the vigilant Quraysh. He finally managed to leave Mecca for Medina. And the Quraysh were obviously trying to stop the flight of capital from their society, and Suhaib struck a bargain with them. He would give all of his possessions and his wealth if they would let him join the Muslims in Medina. And when a now penniless Suhaib reached Medina and told the Prophet ﷺ how he had won his freedom, the Prophet said, "Abu Yahya, this bargain is crowned with success." So next is the Muslims in Medina. Not all the Muslims were able to win their freedom and migrate. The Meccans rejoiced in the poorer Muslims' increased vulnerability and tortured them even more to make them renounce their faith. Walid bin Walid, Ayash bin Abi Rabia, and Hisham bin As were among this group of unfortunate Muslims, and in Medina, the Prophet ﷺ would pray for them and supplicate against the unbelievers who had held them back, and the Muslims remained patient. However, they were finally rescued by their brothers in faith and taken to Medina. And with that, before we start getting into much of the history regarding Medina, let's stop here at page 138, and we'll continue with next week, inshallah, with the difficulties in Medina. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdi ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.